All right, good morning, everyone. I'm very loud. Um, Welcome back to day two. I hope you've had a restful evening and, felt well fed last night. Those of you who were able to join us at the restaurant, it was a lovely kind of moment of food and fellowship with everyone here. So pleased that you've all kind of rested and are ready for our second panel. So today this morning's panel is on knowledge production, and we have three speakers, Rozehnal, Sahar Khamis, and Peter Mandaville. They probably need no introduction because you've had a chance to meet them and learn about their research as well as learn about what wonderful colleagues they are, but I'm going to go ahead and do what I need to do, which is to give the formal introduction. So Dr. Rob Rozenhal is professor and chair of the Department of Religion, Culture, and Society, and the founding director of the Center for Global Islamic Studies, another not rival, that's neighbor, Global Islamic Studies at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from Duke University and an MA in South Asian Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's traveled widely in the Muslim world with extended periods of study and fieldwork research in Pakistan, India, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and Malaysia. Without further ado, Dr. Rozehnal.
So good morning, and I want to add my voice to the sincere round of thanks people have been giving to GNU and for this kind invitation and for everybody that's organized this. I've done several myself at Lehigh, and I know how much work it really is. I deeply appreciate them. You see the title, so I'll just dive right in. In the AI and digital age, Sufism, tasawwuf, survives and even thrives within the virtual ecosystem and its rapidly expanding digital publics. Institutional Sufi orders, Turuk, have gone global and viral in the new millennium. Today, Sufi teachings, poetry, music, and ritual performances are accessible to global audiences via an astounding array of digital media platforms. Just a bit of background on my own work. I'm still stunned and amazed that I'm doing this work. It wasn't what I did initially. It wasn't what I was trained for. It actually emerged from my own teaching in the classroom. We can talk more about that if you like. In 2022, I edited a volume, Cyber Muslims, that focuses on 15 wide-ranging case studies from some fantastic scholars, including one at the end of the table, who come from and work on a variety of locations in the quote, unquote, Muslim world, and who are looking at a diverse array of digital media platforms. And really, the background to this conference, the simple way to put it is I invited my intellectual heroes, people who I had read for my own book, published in 2019 and showed up in the States in 2020, called Cyber Sufis, Virtual Expressions of the American Muslim Experience, in which I explore cyberspace as an alternative media platform for tech-savvy Sufi communities who seek to root or reboot their faith in the US's complex religious topography, and who deploy the internet to expand networks, rethink tradition, and refashion identity among the raucous spiritual marketplace of contemporary American religious life. The main case study in that book is the Inayatiyya Sufi order, the oldest and one of the largest Sufi orders, tariqas in the West, including North America. This is a first wave perennialist Sufi order, hybrid to the core, a hereditary order grounded in Indian, South Asian, and in particular Chishti Nizami past, reshaped by 1960s American counterculture and New Ageism. And I argue in the book, now amplifying and returning to its Indo-Muslim roots. Under the leadership of Pir Zia, pictured here on the right, his grandbrother up top, his father below him. Under Pir Zia's leadership in the past decade, the Inayatiyya has done a total 360 overhaul of their sophisticated digital media platforms. And this started exactly when I was beginning to research for the book. So this became my main case study. But in my work and in my teaching, I'm tracking a number of other American institutional Sufi orders, some of them listed here. They are all diasporic, cross-cultural, transnational, and networked American Sufi communities. And each one of these groups has a vast digital warehouse, sort of flagship websites. And if you get onto those websites, they're multidimensional and multi-tiered and linked to many other social media platforms. The truth and the devil are always in the details. But today I want to use my short time here to focus on the big picture, sort of meta questions, to reflect on how the study of American cyber Sufism might provide a model for the analysis of Muslim digital media writ large. As a closet anthropologist, this kind of pains me because I've kind of jettisoned all the fun stuff. I'm not going to be showing you images, videos, soundscapes. Instead, I'm going to mostly talk and take you through some sort of big picture questions. God help you if your understanding of Sufism is found through web surfing, as it typically is for my Lehigh students. What you find there is a lot of, pervasive confusion about the tradition. This is true in the real world, but amplified exponentially online. It's a sort of wild, wild west where Sufism is a hotly contested and convoluted signifier. There's a lot of DIY Sufism, if you Google. A lot of Sufi-inflected products for sale, self-stylized Sufi masters who appropriate the tradition to various ends. And perfect example of this is what I call Rumi Incorporated, the way in which Jalaluddin Rumi's legacy and memory and physicality and teachings and most importantly poetry have been used and misused and abused by a whole range of authors. Some of them wonderful, others I have a problem. So it's dangerous out there, is what I'm trying to say. So in the book and my work, what I try to do is narrow the focus. So my data are, again, digital media footprints of formal institutional Turuk in the United States of America. These are all cyber communities with real world parallels, with deep institutional histories and memories and practices that take them to a different homeland, a different place, but that are now in America and Americanizing. So my approach is to try to read Sufi sites as a distinct genre of religious text, and sometimes maybe even sacred space. I don't know, convincing, read the book and find it. I try to interpret Sufi digital productions as an alternative platform for piety and practice, networking and narratives, community building and communication. And my thesis, which I'm summarizing today, is that yes, I do think Sufi websites and social media now serve as a critical space for the construction, negotiation, and expression of a distinctly American Muslim identity. If you don't know, in recent years, and I'm talking like decade and a half, there's been a real explosion, subfield of what we might call digital religion, and much more recently, a subset of that subset on cyber Islam. So I'm thinking about the groundbreaking work of Eichelman, and Anderson, and Bruce Lawrence, and of course, Gary Bunt. And I draw on all in my own thinking. I borrow from Zygmunt Bauman to talk about cyberspace and its impact on religious life as a product, technological, and cultural expression of what Bauman calls liquid modernity, the period of contemporary late global capitalism that we're in, where life is constantly changing, hurried, uncertain, and most importantly, highly, highly mediated. Going into the Wayback Machine, I still find Apatarai useful in his idea about mediascapes. You can read, I highlighted some key things, but the idea here is borrowing from Apatarai and other theoretical frames, I approach Sufi websites as alternative religious documents, a virtual imaginarium and a digital sensorium that opens up new spaces for narratives, identity making, social networking, and bridge building. But let's admit it, these are new, distinct, and really weird kinds of texts and spaces, often hyperlinked, fluid, constantly morphing, instantaneous, often anonymous, translocal. They're also sensual and visceral, especially engaging sight and sound. So the challenge for we scholars and also our students staring at this material is, how do you read these sites? How do you read between the lines sometimes in church? I do think that cyberspace now constitutes a distinct public sphere, though certainly not what Habermas had in mind. His vision of an open democratic middle space median between individual citizens and government authorities. Some of that is there. But digital communication is often anonymous and by definition not mediated most often via direct face-to-face exchanges. And if these interpersonal interactions remain exclusively virtual, then cyberspace is a one-way street, a dead-end echo chamber. But the nowhere of cyberspace is always and everywhere populated by real people, embodied in concrete locations and embedded in local communities. And cyber networks can and frequently do circle back to the mundane realm of terrestrial life, of everyday lived experience. And in everyday practice, online encounters often lead to new online and then offline relationships. When true symbiosis between the digital and analog worlds occurs, the virtual can be made real. When we turn to digital Sufism, we can ask, what's new about new media? Amid the liquid modernity of 21st century, cyberspace and its attendant disruptions bring a host of new challenges and potential barriers that threaten to de-center Sufi tradition and Muslim tradition in novel and potentially radical ways. Cyberspace is potentially a direct assault on established Sufi institutional patterns of authority, intimacy, and the dynamics of ritual practice. Can you have a virtual sheikh? Can you really take virtual bayat or initiation? Does virtual zikr work? Can barakah, a divine blessing, be digitized and communicated over fiber optic cable? What is gained, and maybe more importantly, what is lost in this process? The tension, ambiguity, and anxiety about such pressing questions, I suggest, partly explains why Sufis in America and beyond have been relatively late to adapt, adopt, and fully embrace the technological wizardry of digital culture, lagging far beyond their jihadist co-religionists and even other Muslim groups in America and beyond. The salient point here is that every tariqah, wherever we find it, has its own unique history, genealogy, ritual practices, spiritual heroes, geographical orientation, and cultural inflection. Every community necessarily responds then to the pitfalls and possibilities of social media in its own unique way. What I'm trying to say is there's not one pattern, but now I'm going to try to point to some patterns. So how to approach Sufi social media in all its strangeness and wonderful weirdness. I suggest and outline in the book that scholars and students need to be thinking simultaneously about three interdependent frames. So looking at these spaces, images and narratives, how is tradition and community narrated? Ideas of past and place, of genealogy, of connection, of homeland. Where is home? Again, institutional Sufi orders with long pasts and memories that now a new generation is embedded in the American context. So tradition and community, rituals and teaching networks. So we're talking about piety and practice. Yes, you can find very interesting articulations and even expressions and participation online. So master-disciple relationship, initiation, and then the standard stock repertoire that's different for each tariqah, dhikr, prayer, meditation, ziyarat, etc. Sufi rituals at the heart of tradition. And then lastly, you have to think simultaneously about external things. So people engaged in public connections, social welfare, outreach programs, political activism, and interfaith dialogue. All three of those levels are operating simultaneously. And I think to understand the full picture, you have to take all of them seriously. So again, dazzling diversity, but there are some salient patterns. I think, and I'll summarize a few thoughts. Most American Sufi websites are mostly oriented towards information public relations. Very clear, they're outward facing. But having said that, the message is clearly also simultaneously aimed at multiple audiences. So these sites, the flagship websites and the multimedia embedded within them, are very useful for disciples within the tradition, within the order. They use digital media. It serves as a library of institutional history and collective memory, an archive of genealogy and sacred history, a repository of key beliefs and ideas, and definitions of what's unacceptable, a handy manual for ritual practices, especially for beginners, and then also a tool to move outward and share with others. Oh, you're interested in Sufism? Check out the website and then come join us for zikr Thursday night after Sumaiya. It's also an external audience that's simultaneously in mind in the construction of these sites, without a doubt. For non-Muslims, attempts to clarify misperceptions in this horrific environments we live in, which Islamophobia rages, to orient Sufism for non-Muslims in the context of broader Islamic history, to distinguish the particular Sufi community, brotherhood, sisterhood, from others, and yes, to attract potential converts and allies. There's also a second external, third audience, other Muslims. So we see evidence very clearly trying to ground Sufi piety and practice in Islamic piety and sacred history through image and sound and narrative and textual quotation. And most certainly lots of evidence of defending Sufi tradition, its beliefs and practices against Muslim critics, detractors, and attackers. Wahhabis and Salafis don't fare well in many of these Americans. Each of these sites, however, marks a clear boundary, I'm arguing, between online and offline worlds. The producers of these digital spaces seem singularly concerned with controlling the narrative. These sites are mostly not flat space open source forums with live chat rooms and how-to interactive platforms. Instead, they are largely static one-way spaces that communicate information and then, this is the key, invite participation offline in the living community. Most Sufi sites lack really dynamic, vital spaces for online ritual participation. And I suggest, I'm arguing, this pervasive concern with control is not at all surprising, since an open, unleashed digital space profoundly challenges the normative structures, geographical orientation, and pedagogical dynamics of traditional Sufi order. We heard this in the paper on, Marja AI, right? The parallels with Islamic law here are deep. Intimacy, intensity, and presence, the human connection. How can you mirror it online, should you? Reading between the proverbial lines, these sites are primarily designed to assert the legitimacy, normativity, even orthodox of Sufi authority, identity, ritual practice, and institutional structure. I can also point to some broad sort of trend lines around some common themes. So here you just have to believe me, and then more importantly, go look and see if I'm right by actually digging into these sites. If I started digging into these sites, I'd be here for 4 hours, you would fall asleep and leave. So I'm summarizing some big trends. What we see, and again, changing year by year, month by month, and sometimes week by week, increasingly sophisticated, multidimensional, multisensorial websites and displays. Expanding use of multimedia, audio files, photographs, videos, live stream events, more and more and more, with some hesitation. And increasing interface and linkages across multiple platforms. American Sufi communities love Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. They're not really TikToking yet, Christoph, I'm sorry to say. But that will change. And AI, I haven't seen much sophisticated use at all in these flagship institutional Sufi orders. They might be thinking about it, but I have to go back and do more research. When it comes to piety and identity, a dual emphasis, that's again, visually communicated, textually communicated, orally, A-U-R-A-L-L-Y, and orally communicated, that emphasize individual piety and collective identity, and very common, a spotlight on the personality, piety, and charisma of individual teachers. A heavy emphasis on mobility, on travel, on accessibility. We see American Sufi Mashayikh traveling constantly in the United States and beyond to meet disciples and then interact with varied audiences. And then public connections. You can't miss it as soon as you get online. Public programming, lectures, retreats, workshops, conferences, multiple commercial dimensions with paraphernalia of all kinds for sale, and increasingly sophisticated online donation and fundraising campaigns. If you're still with me, I'm moving towards wrapping up because I got a thing held up. American Sufism, past, present, and future. I mean, the past is prologue. I mean, there's been a lot of scholarship that has shown that over time in radically different historical and cultural locations, Sufis have been among the earliest Muslim adopters of new technologies. That's true, certainly to the printing press, and loads of examples. So there's precedent, historical precedent. But I think the future is bright, and that virtual Sufi communities are likely to accelerate and intensify their use of cyberspace as we move towards an increasingly sophisticated and interactive Web 3.0. So AI, augmented reality, virtual reality, it's coming and it's not going away. Why do I think the future is bright? If by bright means more use. One, generational shifts, right? It's not complicated. Go where the kids are, and the kids are online if you want your community to continue. And in my interviews, you see lots of younger disciples or digital natives who are curating these sites, overseen by much older sheikhs who reluctantly sometimes say, yeah, let the kids play. And especially for minority communities, the web offers an ideal platform. It's fast, fluid, multi-vocal, multi-local, cheap, that's key, and instantaneous. And let's not forget, Sufis are double minorities in the United States. So digital media allows these groups to punch above their weight and levels the playing field. And it provides access to vast audiences they never previously would have had. This is not unique to Sufism, of course. And then most importantly, here's where I'll end, because Sufism has internal resources that have the potential to bridge the stark boundaries between online and offline experience, including one, a more pliable, expansive approach to the definition of religious text beyond the fixed canon of Quran, Hadith, and law. We heard this in the luminous keynote address. Vernacular traditions of poetry, music, dance, artistic expression, long history in Sufism. Two, an inclusive notion historically and in practice to sacred space. Wherever a saint is buried, after all, is sacred space, so why not digital media? And I'll end with this, a semantic field and ritual performances that resonate with the idea of virtual reality. In both theory and practice, Sufism has always engaged the non-material realm of the imagination. There's an entire lexicon of Islamic and Sufi terminology that resonates with this basic idea of virtual reality. Zahir batin, element mithal, etc., etc. Virtual experiences, we know, are central to Sufi practice as well. Dreams, visionary experiences, dream interpretation provide realms of insight and experience, and always have, where the barriers between the living and dead, the material and spiritual, heaven and earth, and Allah and humanity are porous and permeable. The centrality of such virtual systems, virtual imagination, virtual rituals in Sufism, I contend, resonates with cyberspace, a parallel non-material virtual dimension that unleashes the creative imagination and at the same time has the capacity to do real work in the everyday lived offline world. Food for thought. We'll look forward to your questions.
Food for thought indeed. Our next speaker is Dr. Sahar Khamis, who's a neighbor as well, geographically, in terms of having a center similar to ours. Sahar Khamis is an award-winning academic with a special expertise in Arab and Muslim media. She's an associate professor in the communications department at the University of Maryland, College Park, and was former head of the Mass Comm and Information Science Department at Qatar University, or in Qatar. Her publications include two co-authored books, Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, and Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement Journalism. And she's also co-edited the book volume, Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished, Gendered Revolutions, in addition to numerous book chapters, articles, and conference papers. She's the recipient of several prestigious academic and professional awards, and is current president of the Arab US Association for Communication Educators. Please welcome Dr. Khamis.
Good morning. So as we are getting the slides up, I just want to say that I'm really honored and delighted to be with all of you this morning and to be part of this very important and timely conference. And many thanks to the Abu Sulaiman Center here at George Mason University, the wonderful faculty and staff and organizers of this very important conference for extending the invitation. And I feel like over these 2 days, yesterday and today, I already made new friends and colleagues, which is awesome. And I hope that we continue these conversations in the future, inshallah. Inshallah. Okay. So the title of my presentation is Muslim Women Shifting Identities in the Digital Age, from Countering Islamophobia to Narrating the Gaza War. So let's talk about the new media landscape. It's important to investigate the shifting media landscape, especially how new media enable platforms for individual and collective expression away from governments and those in power, and giving birth to the phenomena of citizen journalism through amplifying the voices of marginalized and underrepresented groups. At least that is the promise of the internet and the digital age, is to give this kind of platform for marginalized and underrepresented voices to be heard through citizen journalism. So of course you have all of these different digital platforms, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, TikTok, Flickr, you name it, all of them are existing there in what we call now the digital sphere or the cyberspace. So the digital ummah, of course, is the new era witnessed by the rise of the concept of the digital ummah. This new era witnessed the rise of the concept of digital ummah or virtual ummah in cyberspace, since the internet as a transformative technology has bridged geographical barriers among many different Muslims, allowing a wider range of voices to enter the public sphere and to articulate different understandings of Islam, reflecting multiple collective identities and complex realities globally. Of course, professors like Gary Bonds, Professor Peter Mandaville, that we have here with us, of course, are some of the leading scholars and experts in this concept of digital ummah and virtual ummah. Yours truly, also the first book that I co-authored, Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, co-authored with Muhammad al-Nawawi, also touched upon this notion of the digital ummah and the virtual ummah and how it's playing out in cyberspace. So Islamic cyber feminism, I love to think that Islam and feminism go hand in hand, and I love to think of the concept of Islamic feminism and therefore Islamic cyber feminism. Using a post-colonial feminist intersectional lens and approach, it is important to provide an overview of the plethora of online activities which different segments of Muslim women from different parts of the world, representing different varying interests, ideologies, orientations, and backgrounds, are engaging in through participating in a wide array of online causes, communities, and initiatives to exercise resistance, express their identities, and extend solidarity and support. So we have different examples. Of course, Muslim women globally use the internet not just as a window for them to see the rest of the world, while also being seen by the rest of the world, but also as a tool, or even we can go as far as saying as a weapon, to fight back against the many different attempts to sideline them, to profile them, to stigmatize them, or to silence them. And this created the new form of quote-unquote cyber Islamic feminism, which is a concept I like to talk about in my own writings and publications. Their efforts to deeply use the digital media as a platform that gives voice to the voiceless is clearly evidenced in their online efforts to counter Islamophobia and to also narrate the recent tragic Gaza war. So I'm going to focus here on two different angles. The first one is countering Islamophobia, and then the second one will be narrating the most recent and tragic Gaza war. So let's talk first about countering Islamophobia. The changing political landscape, as we all know, especially after 9/11, of course, led to a surge in Islamophobia, which is commonly defined as excessive and irrational and exaggerated fear of Islam and Muslims and the Muslim way of life. And this resulted in the spread of negative stereotypes and misconceptions and misrepresentations about Islam and Muslims at large, and Muslim women as well. And this is especially true for Muslim women who suffer from multiple layers of invisibility. I argue that there are different layers of invisibility for Muslim women, whether in the academy, in academic work, in the media, or in the public sphere in everyday life. And therefore, they started to use digital media platforms in order to shed light on their complex identities, activisms with a plural S, and resistances also with a plural S, and their lived realities. One example is a campaign called #CanYouHearUsNow. I will not read word for word just in the interest of time, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with the incident that happened back in 2016, when at that time presidential candidate Donald Trump commented on the appearance of Khizr Khan and his wife, Mrs. Ghazala Khan. They appeared in the Democratic National Convention, and she was standing beside her husband. She saw the image of her son, who was killed in war. He's a martyr, an American martyr. And she was standing there silent because she was very emotional. And he made a comment like, "Oh, Look at his wife. She was standing there silent. Maybe she was not even allowed to talk. She was not allowed to speak. So in resistance to that and as pushing back against this narrative of the silent or silenced Muslim women, a large number of Muslim women across different generations and races and ethnicities started a hashtag campaign on Twitter, which is now X, hashtag Can You Hear Us Now, to amplify their own voices and to push back against this narrative of being silent or silenced. So they started to say things like, I am a teacher, I'm a professor. When I go in the classroom, I'm the only one who is allowed to speak. Hashtag, can you hear us now? I'm an expert. I work in NASA and I have the expertise. When I talk to my team, I'm the one who's allowed to speak and I'm the one who is heard the most. Hashtag, can you hear us now? So it became like a campaign to push back against this, misrepresentation or misconception of the silent and silenced Muslim woman. And here is one image from this campaign. As you can see, these women, they come from different ages, different generations, different races, ethnicities. And the campaign was organized by Karama. Karama in Arabic means dignity, right? And it is a group of Muslim American lawyers, Muslim American women lawyers who fight for women's civil rights and representation. It is based here in the United States. Another campaign that also was pushing back against Islamophobia or countering Islamophobia is hashtag hands off my hijab. And that campaign was, again, I'm not going to read word for word in the interest of time, but of course we all know about the difficulties that women in Europe, especially in France, have been facing with the French laws, some of which banned the niqab. The niqab, of course, is the face veil, as many of you might know, and also banning women from wearing the hijab under the age of 18. These French Muslim women felt that this is an infringement on their own rights, and they said, hashtag hands off my hijab. This campaign went viral on social media using this hashtag, and it started to draw solidarity from people across the world, from different celebrities and different people. Some of them are Muslim, some of them are non-Muslim, some of them are wearing the hijab themselves, some of them are not wearing the hijab, but they stood in solidarity. And some of them even said something like, if you are mad or angry at the Iranian government for imposing the hijab, but you are not angry or mad at the French government for banning the hijab, then this is hypocrisy. This is the kind of rhetoric or language that was used in this campaign to push back against this type of infringement on women's rights. And here is one image from this campaign, hashtag hands off my hijab, which became a very iconic image used by Muslim women online in order to display this kind of visual, like hands off my hijab, do not touch my hijab, and do not infringe upon my rights. Another example for also countering Islamophobia was hashtag Muslim Women's Day, which was a campaign organized also online. And it started in 2017 after the Muslim travel ban. There's Muslim travel ban 1, there's Muslim travel ban 2. It's like, okay, we're not going to get there. But anyway, that's a big infringement on Muslim Americans and their civil rights, and also banning women, people from coming from, dominant Muslim majority countries. Of course, a lot of people started to be very angry about that. There were big protests on the streets, but there was also a lot of digital activism. And part of this digital activism was hashtag Muslim Women's Day, which started to amplify the identity of Muslims at large and Muslim women in particular, using things like, traditionally unsubmissive Muslima. I'm a Muslima, I'm a Muslim woman, I identify as such, I am unapologetic about it, and I'm not submissive in any way, shape, or form. So again, this narrative of not being silent or silenced and pushing back and asserting your own identity was used very much in cyberspace. Some of them also started to say, we do not need saving. Hashtag Muslim Women's Day is an attempt to say we are against the quote-unquote save the Muslim woman syndrome. You might have heard about that before, like, oh my God, what can we do in order to help the poor Muslim women? The women in Afghanistan, they need our help. We have to support them, right? So this is called the Save the Muslim Woman Syndrome. Some scholars have written about it, Suad Joseph, Layla Abu Lughod, among others, right? So these women are like, no, thank you so much. We don't need saving. We are not going to use this kind of rhetoric. We are strong, we are assertive, we can stand for ourselves, we can speak for ourselves in the real world as well as online. And the creator of this campaign of hashtag the Muslim Women's Day was a young woman called Amani Al-Khattaqa, who actually has her own magazine called Muslim Girl. And she is a kind of a blend between, being very stylish. At the same time, she wears the hijab, but she's also very fashionable. representing this new trend of the new generation of Muslim women. And she was the driving force behind the hashtag Muslim Women's Day. That's her, and that's the cover of Muslim Girl magazine. Now, that was the part about countering Islamophobia. The second part of the presentation is very much about another type of expression of Muslim women's identities, in this case, in the realm of the most recent Gaza war, because of course there was more than one, as you all know, unfortunately. And Muslim women, in this case, Palestinian women in particular, started to use digital media to push back against two important narratives that have been circulating in mainstream Western media about Palestinian women: the villains or the victims. So either they were represented as villains, oh, they are the suicide bombers, as you see on this picture here on the left, with the suicide bombers, or they are mothers of suicide bombers, right? So that is trying to show them as quote unquote the villains in mainstream Western media. Or the other representation was the victims, right? They're starving, they're victims of starvation, and they are just, people are dying, which is true, of course, that there is starvation and famine and people are dying and all of that stuff. But again, that has been what we call in the media framing. So the framing is either villains or victims. Now, are there other representations out there? Well, the Palestinian digital activist women started to use digital media tools in order to push back against these types of stereotypical representations or misrepresentations. So we have a number of young digital activists, whether it is Bisan Ouda or Hind Khudari or Palestia Al-Aqad, or for example, Bayan Abu Sultan or Iman Lulu. These are just a few examples among many who started to use digital media tools in order to assert a different story and to express a different identity and reality for Palestinian women. One of these frames, the alternative framing, was the frame of sumud. Sumud, of course, is resilience, right? When you are very resilient, you insist on your rights, you're very perseverant, we call that sumud in Arabic. So all the Palestinian digital activists examined featured videos of women and girls enduring horrific war conditions. They all emphasized the resilience and steadfastness of Palestinian women. In a post shared by Hind Khudari, one of these young Palestinian digital activists, one Palestinian woman shared her story, her experience of being displaced multiple times during the war, but insisting on staying in Gaza. The woman said, I have been displaced more than once. I've been asked to leave my place, to go somewhere else, but hey, I'm not leaving my place, I'm not leaving Gaza. So that's the theme of sumud, resilience, and steadfastness. Also, some digital creators participated in the Day in the Life. Day in the Life became a campaign which also was digitally proliferated. It was a trend which typically featured a creator performing routine everyday tasks, such as cooking, baking, cleaning, doing the household chores, witnessing these women resourcefully create their own meals, routines, and livelihoods in the midst of war, in the midst of destruction, in the midst of displacement, in the midst of all of these tragedies, is again emphasizing this theme of sumud or resilience in and of itself. Also, Palestinian women also featured as organizers of collective action, while many of the digital creators illuminated how women also, and girls, they were also navigating the harsh conditions of war and displacement and all of these horrific things, while at the same time working towards community engagement, community mobilizations, calls for collective action, right? Like really taking matters in their own hands and trying to get their own communities organized and engaged and to engage in collective action. You don't see this kind of stuff in mainstream Western media or media at large. Therefore, it's important to show these alternative narratives. Another theme was spreading joy. Another dimension of Palestinian women's digital activism was showing the resistance mechanisms being used, not just the resilience and steadfastness and collective engagement and community engagement, but also even in the midst of all of these horrific tragedies, we are still able to exercise joy. We are still able to hold weddings and celebrations and celebrate a newly born baby and celebrate a newlywed. And there was this one interview on one of the social media posts by Palestia Al-Aqab. She interviewed a woman, and the woman said, you see this tent? This tent is like the palace of Sheikh Zayed. It's a small place, but it really encompasses everybody. It is big enough for all my loved ones, right? So it's a small tent, obviously, of a displaced woman under very horrific conditions, but she's describing it as if it is the tent of Sheikh Zayed because it's open for everybody. You can see here the symbolism, which is very, very strong. So, concluding remarks, right? So these examples clearly illustrate a unique amalgamation of multidimensional activities in cyberspace, signaling both the complexity and hybridity of these new digitalized mediated spaces, as well as the identities and agencies competing within them simultaneously. What is evident from these examples is the emergence of a heterogeneous virtual ummah that mirrors the transformation, hybridization, and negotiation of Muslim women's gendered identities as they constantly oscillate between tradition and modernity, the old and the new. These feminist positions of in-betweenness in cyberspace actually cross-cuts the boundaries between localization and globalization, tradition and modernity, the online and the offline, the private and the public, the national and the international, the social and the political, as well as the secular and the religious, right? So you see this kind of intersection, you see this kind of overlaps, and you see this kind of in-between position. Muslim women are engaging in Islamic cyber feminism when they effectively exercise their agency online and offline and utilize the opportunities made possible in cyberspace to resist misrepresentation, stereotyping, profiling, and marginalization, express their unique and varied identities, and create solidarity with each other online. However, this is never a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. Rather, it varies based on different temporal, spatial, and demographic factors, right? So you have to also be always sensitive to the fact that this is a dynamic, fluid process. It's not static. It's going to change across different cultural, political, social, and generational contexts. The internet is a necessity, but insufficient tool when it comes to supporting Muslim women's causes. It can increase their visibility, amplify their voices, and act as a catalyst for desired change, as a supplementary and complementary tool. But it cannot be a replacement for on-the-ground organization and activism and other forms of in-person mobilization. We learned this lesson the hard way in the Arab Spring uprisings, right? Like, yes, you can use the internet to amplify voices, to raise awareness, to create solidarity, to get people out in the street, to mobilize, but it stops there. You need much more than that if you really want to enact change in the real world. So this is the last slide. So this really compels us to adopt the middle ground of what we can call cyber realism, which avoids the two undesirable extremes of cyber optimism or cyber pessimism, which either overestimate or underestimate the significance of the internet's role. In other words, a cyber optimist would be like, yes, the internet is the end all be all, like the moment of techno euphoria that many scholars, including myself, I admit, we had that at the beginning of the Arab Spring. Just give people the internet, they're going to have democracy. Hello. 14 years later, we're like, no, you definitely need much more than that, right? Or cyber pessimism is like, oh, no, just forget about the internet. It's not going to do anything. The situation is still the same. It's even worse. No, you need to be in the middle ground of cyber realism where you weigh the pros and cons, the limitations, as well as the opportunities. Likewise, it compels us to adopt a balanced and realistic approach when evaluating the phenomena of Muslim women's gendered activism in general and their online activism in particular, by acknowledging both the contributions and the limitations of the phenomena of cyber feminism, right? So again, yes, they have made progress. Yes, good steps were taken in the right direction. Does that mean that we are beyond patriarchy, beyond discrimination, beyond Islamophobia, beyond all of these tragedies? Of course not, right? So we just have to acknowledge the progress made, but also acknowledge the limitations at the same time. It is safe to predict that the push and pull mechanisms within and between these various domains will continue to shape and reflect Muslim women's complex realities, shifting identities, and hybrid narratives within the equally dynamic and hybrid world of cyberspace moving forward. So this is an ongoing, unfolding process and phenomena that we're going to witness for years to come in many different forms and across many different contexts. And with that, I want to thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Okay, our next and final speaker on this panel actually doesn't really need an introduction, but for the purposes, because he's so well known, not only to me, but to many of you in the audience, but for the sake of cover all bases and give Peter his due, let me read you this is a very brief summary of his many accomplishments. So Peter Mandaville is Professor of International Affairs in the Shar School of Policy and Government, and the Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies here at George Mason University. From 2024 to 2025, he served as the director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and senior advisor for faith engagement at the now defunct USAID. And that was through no fault of his own, right? I don't know who to blame for that. From 2022 to 2024, he was senior advisor for religion and inclusive societies at the equally defunct US Institute of Peace, now known by another name, and probably not doing what kind of important work that Peter was involved in when he was there. Without further ado, Dr. Mandaville. I know, don't ever work where he worked. So.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Sumaiya, for that introduction, and to my co-panelists for their contributions. I want to start with by saying that I feel a little bit like an imposter on this panel, insofar as it's been a very long time since I have worked actively on the intersection of Islam and the internet or digital life. In fact, in the original schema of the conference, I wasn't even going to be on it. I'm serving as something of an avatar for Gary Bunt, whose work has already been cited numerous times, and who is obviously one of the most prolific and productive scholars in this subfield. Gary, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it due to a scheduling conflict, and so I maybe against my better judgment, thought that it would be a wonderful opportunity to just reflect on how the study of the intersection of Islam and the internet has evolved over the last almost 30 years or so. And it sort of led me to a title for the talk that may seem a little cryptic, but I hope it'll become clear what I'm talking about here. And this is the idea of asking us to think about what it means to talk about Islam after the internet. So there was a time when I did sort of have some credentials in this area, and Sahar was very generous to reference. This is actually one of my proudest moments as a young junior scholar. When I landed the cover article of the second edition of the newsletter, the Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World, to mention yet another defunct. Yeah, I know. This is this is based on work that I started doing in 1997, and at that time, you really could count on one hand the number of us that were kind of exploring the intersection of Islam and the internet. Rob mentioned John Anderson, who I think really was the original pioneer. And then Gary and I kind of started dipping our toes in the water. And of course, then Anderson and Eichelman kind of linked up, and the field really, the subfield was born properly. But the questions that we were asking at that time were themselves reflective of the way that society more broadly was understanding the nature and the meaning and the significance of the internet and the information society and online life. And so, when we were in the late 90s, early 2000s looking at this, at least in my work, the kinds of questions I had in mind were more questions about what kind of impact would the rise of the internet have on traditional structures of authority in the Muslim world, right? Because that was part of this broader idea that the internet would be mainly a democratizing force. It would empower voices that were previously not heard in a wide range of domains, including the production of religious knowledge, to be part of the conversations and to perhaps bypass the gatekeepers who tended to be the traditional custodians of traditional religious knowledge. So, the idea that through the internet, quote unquote, lay Muslims would be able to access sources of religious knowledge, texts, enormous collections of hadith, and work with them and engage them critically in ways that had been previously the sole preserve of the ulama and classically trained Islamic scholars with certain kinds of credentials. We found, of course, very quickly that the incumbent authorities learned to play this game as well. But even there, you started to see some early efforts to address power asymmetries within Muslim knowledge production globally through the mechanisms provided by the internet. So, for example, in the late 90s, again, it's still the relatively early days of the World Wide Web. If you went online looking for collections of fiqh, you would primarily encounter meticulously curated collections produced by the seminaries of Qom and Mashhad. So it was initially Jafari fiqh that you found most readily available online until some of the more traditional Sunni sources caught up. And soon thereafter, you had Azhari certified collections of online fatwa and the such that were available. So these were the kinds of questions we were asking at that point. This was also a time when I think we were asking questions about or understanding the idea of a clear distinction and delineation between online life and offline life, or online life and the real world. And I remember thinking to myself when I did eventually kind of move away from this field. And again, I had actually intended for the study of Islam and the internet sort of be my academic career. But then I got kind of pulled away from it, basically as a function of living in Washington, D.C. in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the sort of birth of the counterterrorism industry and various other kinds of strange knowledge production that was associated with that government work. But I remember as I watched from the sidelines as other young scholars began to engage this work, some of them were starting to ask questions around the idea that, well, one thing we want to understand is if indeed, young Muslims today are having their views and understanding of their religion shaped by what's going on online, we want to know, like, what happens when they go offline? How does what they encounter and learn and absorb online have a concrete impact on the way that they behave offline, right? But again, that is informed or underpinned by an assumption that online and offline are two very different things, right? And this was accurate, I think, broadly speaking, in terms of the sociology of media and knowledge consumption as that field operated in the early 2000s. And so what I want to do now, in the same way that the early questions about whether Islam would democratize or whether the internet would democratize Islam seems kind of antiquated, I also think that in today's world, where any sort of boundary or clear boundary between living online and living offline seems increasingly fuzzy, right? Digital media, our encounter with mediated and digitized information is just persistent and ubiquitous, in the sense that, for many young people today, this online-offline distinction doesn't really make much sense. There are entire aspects of their lives that are constituted and proceed exclusively online, And in many ways, what happens, in what we would still recognize as offline is actually shaped primarily by things that are going on online. And so a second sort of tectonic or structural change that I'm getting at here in terms of kind of reaching towards some kind of concluding questions that I want to pose, again, as food for thought, as we think about the potential futures of the intersection of Islam and digital life, is this idea of a sort of decreased distinction between online and offline. So let's turn again to the question of religious authority, because even though the early questions that we were asking seem out of date, I still think, and this is certainly to me the most interesting space to engage. I like the way that Rob apologized for giving us a talk that was going to be exclusively ideas and concepts, and then immediately put up 3 rich slides full of examples of stuff. Like you can take the anthropologist out of religion, but you can't take that. So when we think about how religious authority operates in the Muslim world today, I do think that the rise of digital media has been fundamentally transformative in here. And I think what it calls us to recognize is that religious authority operates today not in any institutionalized or personified sense. Institution al-Azhar, personified marja. Not to say that the institutions and the persons are irrelevant, but they are simply sort of one among an ecosystem, an ecology of practices, voices, and spaces that increasingly constitute this much broader landscape of religious authority production and circulation. So, of course, there are the traditional scholars, but there's key and very important roles played by digital influencers today. There are entire contemporary Islamic movements that exist only on Instagram. Right? So I think, for example, of the Hijra movement in Southeast Asia. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It was born on and sort of operates primarily on Instagram, and it is, kind of creating and curating and projecting what you might call high culture neo-Salafi lifestyles, right? So very modest, very conservative, but incredibly elegant, high Paris fashion house style dress, exquisitely and beautifully posed and photographed. And if those of you who've not seen it, I'd encourage you to take a look. And then I also, would point to sort of various domains of activism, the roles that educators that are not, operating out of traditional Islamic centers of learning play in this work. And also just the fact that you have any number of, subcultures that are networked with each other that are vociferously debating and talking about at high speed, and the speed factor I'll get to in a moment, they're understanding and debating with each other about what Islam has to say about this, that, or what it means to encounter a given issue as a Muslim. I think one other thing that's important to recognize is that the categories that we're talking about here are not necessarily ones that hold very cleanly. Part of what's going on here, I think, and this is kind of reflections informed by my own participation in a set of debates around the concept of post-Islamism, is the idea that increasingly today, the clarity and the boundaries around around religion as a distinct domain are collapsing, becoming more fuzzy. As we know already from the insights of anthropologists of religion like Salah al-Assad, the very constitution of religion as a distinct category has its own very specific genealogy. But what I mean by that is that what you will see today are traditional religious scholars, and by that I mean people who literally hold the appropriate ijazah from institutions associated with Deoban or Al-Azhar. So they have this formal scholarly credentials, but who deploy and engage other very different and distinct domains of life. So I'm thinking here of forms of religious discourse and authority making that combine, for example, aspects of religion and entertainment at the same time, religion and physical fitness. So there was sort of a, I don't know when this started. Abdurrahman Malik will know sort of debates more clearly, right? It's a subculture of online muftis in the UK who are also like the gym-going bros, right? So they're like, fatwa, 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 rep, and they're punk, and they're dressed a certain way. And it's a styling that is designed to appeal to a very particular type of gendered Muslim subjectivity in a particular generation of the British Muslim scene. Another one is this guy who uses Pokemon cards as a way to, he basically talks about the halal versus haram nature of different Pokemon as a way to sort of do Islamic education, right? And so these sort of mixing of genres that I think starts to kind of render ever more unstable the idea of religion as a clear and distinct category that it has clear boundaries in terms of what it is, where it happens, and what kinds of things are relevant to it. And so this is where I think we're asked to think about questions of how Muslim identities are performed and iterated, and how different specific demographic groups engage. Now then, and kind of now on a clear arc towards wrapping up, I mentioned this idea of the increased tempo, the acceleration factor, right? The way that we expect information and answers always to be available very quickly, right? And this is again where I think the traditional scholars start to kind of lose out, right? Because here we're used to a model whereby a question is asked to scholar. Scholar deliberates and provides answer, and that might take a while. We saw with the AIs yesterday that you can actually sometimes get that very quickly, but you're absent that kind of personalized or personal aspect of the kind of authority and knowledge production process. I remember having conversations with a good friend, Shahid Amanullah, who some of you may know, I don't know, 15 years ago. He was, as you know, a great entrepreneur. He and I were playing around with the idea of a service that he wanted to call Quick Think. And it was the idea that you could record yourself doing a short video asking a scholar a question, which would be immediately sent out to a sort of online, there would be sort of religious scholars on duty, ready to receive it and quickly record a quick answer back to you that would be delivered to you. So you would get the rapid response, you'd get an actual face, a real scholar. But again, even that today, that idea from like 2015, seems rather antiquated. And so I think it then becomes important to recognize that the tempo of moral reasoning is changing. And it means that the ways in which people looking for answers go about seeking that knowledge looks rather different. So to kind of begin to conclude, I want to mention what I sort of see as a series of tensions that kind of lie at the emerging horizons of the question of digital life interfaces with Islam. One is this distinction between pluralization and coherence, right? That there's all of the information, all of the answers, all of the possibilities are out, right? And all of you will be familiar with the concept of fatwa shopping, right? You look for an answer, you go, you know what answer you want, right? You know what your preference would be. You just need to make sure that it's Islamic. So you go online, look for a fatwa. Oh, I don't like that one. Look some more. Don't like that one either. Look some more. Oh, that's good. That's and sheikh. Oh, that's a good sheikh. Okay, and then right. But if Islam is anything you want it to be, then you begin to feel nervous, right? And I believe that indeed the increased attraction of Salafism, many young people today, usually tends to get credit by, tends to be explained by billions of dollars of, Saudi Wahhabi export activities. It's an aspect of it. But I also think that there's something about Salafism that is very attractive because it has a very confined and constrained framework in which it provides answers. It's very clear that it's not just Islam is not anything we want it to be. Islam has very specific normative reference points and structures that need to be engaged in order to produce Islamic knowledge. So I think this tension between a desire for having all the things and all of the information and having a sort of coherent understanding of the religion, continues. Sort of distinctions between visibility and vulnerability, right? The idea that the digital life allows you to be present, to have a voice in the conversation, and yet at the same time, as we think about the ever-growing pervasiveness of not just state surveillance, but corporate surveillance, the way that data and information about us is monetized and gathered, that there's that tension between visibility and vulnerability. And then finally, this sort of question of a tension between creativity and constraint, that content creators have tools that allow them this endless array of possibilities in terms of the way that they curate and disseminate particular understandings and constructions of what it means to be a Muslim, that nonetheless still have to deal with and contend with the persistence of certain kinds of constraints to the production of religious knowledge associated with ongoing power dynamics. So finally, to me, the final question, the concluding question that I'm kind of led to ask in terms of how this goes forward, is not so much as it was in the 90s, what impact will Islam have on the internet? Because to finally come to the title of my talk, I think we're clearly after the internet at this point, in the sense of the internet being this separate space where you, quote unquote, sometimes go online. And so what kinds of Islam, what kinds of Muslim futures, the purpose of this conference, are being made possible by the pervasive and ubiquitous mediascapes, to cite Padrai, of whom I also continue to be a fan, are being made possible by the digital worlds that we inhabit today. Thank you very much.